A red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized.
Les troupes de Bachar Al-Assad, dans la nuit et ce matin, ont procédé à un véritable massacre.
الحكومة السورية والجيش السوري لم يستخدموا السلاح الكيميائي أبداً.
الله أكبر. الله أكبر.
Now we must stand up and act.
The army launched its offensive well before sunrise. On August 21st, 2013, governmental forces tried to take over rebel-held positions in the Ghouta area outside Damascus. Just hours after the first shots were fired, footage of victims of chemical weapons were splashed across social media and TV screens around the world. In all, 11 sites were believed to have been hit.
It was the apocalypse. They used planes to attack and forced people to take shelter in cellars. Then they used chemical weapons, followed by artillery to spread the gas, and finally planes again.
My first reaction was really horror, because I thought that the team is right now in Damascus. The team of investigators is in Damascus actually looking at evidence in 3 other places. I mean, it was Khan al-Assal and 2 other sites that we had identified. And Ghouta, of course, is a suburb of Damascus, so it's very close. And I thought, how could that possibly have happened when they are in the town, when they're in the country, and when they're actually investigating?
I was not surprised at all. I know that Bashar al-Assad will do anything necessary in order to stay in power.
Logically speaking, the Syrian government wouldn't have had the need or the audacity to use chemical weapons while inspectors were on the ground. It does not make sense.
I had then immediately consultations. I'd called the Vice Foreign Minister. He did not really give a lot of detail. I pressed him for the investigators to have access to it. And then the Secretary General asked me to immediately proceed to Damascus to negotiate with the government access to Ghouta.
From the very beginning, we gave experts the go-ahead to investigate in the Ghouta, even though this area was not part of the agreement we signed with the Secretary General.
After 2 days of negotiations, that they would give us access, they would give the investigators access. So we had already, in the meantime, planned for that access. So the minute we got the green light, we said, fine, we're going to go in. And that's the first time, I believe, ever that you had an investigation of possible chemical weapons use within 4 days. It was very, very fast after it happened. So everything was very fresh.
Between 300 and 1,400 Syrians are believed to have died in the chemical attacks. The Syrian regime and the rebels were blaming each other, but for Western powers, there was little doubt Bashar al-Assad's forces were responsible for the attacks. Washington was forced to take action. Back in the summer of 2012, Barack Obama had made the use of chemical weapons a red line.
He thought that that would dissuade them from using them. Then in the fall of 2012, he began moving them around. And then the United States shifted its red line. It said, well, it's not use or movement of chemical weapons, it's just use. And then when he began using them, the U.S. changed its red line again in the spring of 2013 to systematic use. But then by August of 2013, the number of incidents and the scale of the incidents clearly were systematic, and that triggered the red line.
After those attacks, the President invited me and Senator Graham to the Oval Office. He said he had 3 objectives. One's to upgrade the capabilities of the Free Syrian Army, downgrade the capabilities of Bashar al-Assad, and 3 was to change the momentum on the battlefield so that Bashar al-Assad no longer had the advantage. Unfortunately, the president never mentioned that again.
They needed a media shock, a humanitarian shock. They needed to show Syrian blood on TV and blame the Syrian government for these massacres. They needed an excuse.
The United States government and other Western governments got members of the opposition out of the country and brought them outside to test them. And we knew that chemical weapons were being used in Syria. So it took a few days to get some of these samples from the Ghouta out. And there, those samples were matched with the other evidence. And that was as firm as evidence as the United States could come up with at that time.
Public opinion in Damascus, Paris, and Washington was still haunted by the Iraq debacle. 10 years after the Iraq War, would the U.S. want to launch another military intervention with no formal proof? At the time, UN inspectors had yet to confirm the use of chemical weapons.
Iraq is the ghost hanging in the room, obviously. Nobody wants to do the same thing again. There's a natural, understandable suspicion, given that the circumstances on the surface seem somewhat similar.
That's what I told the Secretary General. That's what I told Mrs. Kane. That's what I told Dr. Selstrom. That's what I told everyone at the time. Don't repeat the Iraqi scenario. You represent the so-called United Nations, the so-called international community. So don't fall into the trap of being used shamelessly by Syria's aggressors.
Unlike the Iraq War, in Syria, the opposition and the government agreed on one thing. Chemical weapons were used on August 21st, and scores of Syrians died in the attack. UN inspectors confirmed that weeks later, but did not say who had carried out the attack. The inspectors' limited mandate barred them from identifying who was responsible.
If I, for example, take you back to the chemical weapons attack that took place in the Tokyo subway, there was sarin that was used there in '97, and that was a very pure form of sarin. And if it's very pure form, it evaporates very quickly. The sarin that was used in the Ghouta attack was a lot more sophisticated, meaning it's mixed with stabilizers, so it stays on the ground a lot longer, meaning it affects more people.
Well, the intelligence agency had very little doubt. They had a variety of indicators, first including samples and the nature of the bodies that were found there. They calculated, I think, the trajectory of the weapons and where they would have come from, which would have been the government side, not the rebel side. And they concluded, just as a matter of logic, that that these were weapons that were in the hands of the government, and that the rebels had nothing of that scale.
I mean, you have a lot of information that's in the internet, so you actually can do things that, let's say, 20 years ago you could not do, simply because you didn't have access to the information. So it's no longer the domain of a sophisticated scientist, let's put it that way. I think there are people who would be able to do it, and I wouldn't say that it's exclusively in the domain of the government.
I think the regime wanted to challenge the world, to tell everyone they would do whatever they wanted.
It never crossed Syrian military or political leaders' minds to use chemical weapons against our own people. It's crazy. It does not make sense.
When it comes to you asked me again about who used it, that's where the difficult question comes. Can you actually prove in court who used it? No, you cannot.
At the time, Western capitals stepped up the pressure. The US deployed its military off the coast of Syria, and France announced it would take part in targeted strikes.
The chemical massacre in Damascus cannot remain unanswered. France is ready to punish those who made the vile decision of using gas against innocent people.
I think they were ready to strike and they had targets, and I know that other countries in the region were ready to strike too.
It was taken very seriously by the military command and all the necessary measures were taken. We would have retaliated with all the means at our disposal.
Just as Western leaders were taking the media by storm, Bashar al-Assad focused on his communication. Barely 10 days after the attacks, foreign journalists who had been kept out of the country were suddenly invited in large numbers. The Syrian president and his ministers granted interview after interview to the foreign media. Did Syria's PR offensive succeed, or did the fear of a new Iraq prevail? Either way, on August 29th, the British government voted against a military intervention, dealing a serious blow to Barack Obama's plans.
Unlock! Suddenly, you had a situation where 10 years after the United States and France ruptured over Iraq, suddenly France was our closest ally. France was the one we were most in agreement on when it came to Syria. The idea of freedom for eyes was out, and Britain was the one we had felt abandoned by rather than France.
I think it had an effect, of course. I think the vote in the British Parliament had an effect, but the United States doesn't follow the British anymore. The British follow the United States.
Barack Obama himself, I think, is ambivalent about being involved in yet another Middle East war. He takes a walk on the south lawn of the White House with his chief of staff, Dennis McDonough, one night. They circle around and around for 40 minutes talking it through, and that's where he comes up with the idea that I'm going to go to Congress and ask them to vote on this.
No Congress in any country can sanction these things. What are they sanctioning? They're sanctioning an act of aggression, because anything that doesn't fit into the framework of the UN Security Council is an act of aggression, except self-defense.
4 days later, Barack Obama met with Vladimir Putin, Syria's staunchest ally. Despite the smiles, the atmosphere at the St. Petersburg G20 summit was tense. The Syrian war and the asylum granted to former NSA contractor Edward Snowden were just some of the sensitive issues. But against all odds, a resolution to the crisis began to emerge.
President Putin pulls President Obama aside on the sidelines of this G20 meeting, and they sit down in a couple chairs on the side of the room while the other leaders are kind of staring over and watching them. And in this conversation, Putin raises the idea again of cooperation on securing Syria's chemical weapons. And Obama isn't sure. He's skeptical. He doesn't know whether this is a serious thing or not. They tell John Kerry about it. Kerry goes out and makes a statement a few days later. He's asked at a press conference, well, what could Syria do to avoid an attack?
He could turn over every single bit of his chemical weapons to the international community in the next week. Turn it over, all of it.
And suddenly it seems like this is a real possibility. What people didn't pay attention to was his next sentence, where he says, but that's not going to happen. He was making what he thought was a debating point. He didn't actually think this was serious. But then he gets back on his plane and he gets a phone call from Sergei Lavrov. And he says, I saw what you said. We're going to make that proposal publicly. We're going to actually do this for real. And Kerry's like, look, we don't want to play any games here. This is only going to work if you're actually serious about it. And Lavrov says, we're serious about it.
At first, it looked like Kerry gave a statement that wasn't really thought through. But it was definitely something that had been carefully thought through.
The Russians played our Secretary of State like a violin. I think it was terribly mishandled, and I think it was an enormous blow to our prestige and influence in the world, and I think we see repercussions of that, including what Vladimir Putin is doing in Crimea and eastern Ukraine as we speak. The United States of America is on the wane.
According to the Syrian opposition, Israel, officially at war with Damascus for the past 50 years, was also pushing for the U.S. to accept the offer.
The Israelis were afraid of the deterrent nature of the chemical weapons. They wanted to have that weapon. They asked the U.S. for it. 2 days after the chemical weapons attack, Israeli President Shimon Peres said the Syrians must give up their chemical weapons and they have to be destroyed.
For us, the chemical weapons had one single goal: deterring the Israelis in case they were thinking of using their nuclear weapons against us.
The US gave the Russians the green light. For the first time, a country at war would get rid of its chemical weapons. France, however, wanted stricter framing of the process, but Russia and the US dismissed France's request and decided to negotiate face-to-face. In October, the first chemical weapons were dismantled and destroyed. Damascus was given a June 30th deadline to get rid of its arsenal, but the regime was soon behind schedule.
The Syrian government is delaying the destruction of its chemical weapons. In the report I saw yesterday, only 5% of the chemical weapons have been taken out of Syria. As of February the 1st, it should have been 100%.
It's not true that the regime is ready to give up all its chemical weapons in Syria.
There's no way to know if the Syrian regime disclosed all of their weapons. And actually, most Western governments don't think that they've disclosed all of their agents and that they will keep some as a deterrent against the rebels.
There is reports of chemical weapons being used recently, which wouldn't surprise me, but I think he will very slowly remove those chemicals weapons, which he is already slowly doing, because he knows that there will be no attack on him as long as the chemical weapons are being moved. So it's one of the great tragedies.
The unwelcome consequence of this is that by cooperating with Bashar al-Assad to remove the weapons, in effect, the international community in the United States and France are now, in effect, in bed with Assad.
Bashar al-Assad knows very well that his usefulness to the United States, to Europe, and to Russia, and everyone else rapidly drops off after he delivers those chemical weapons. After that, he is just the most powerful warlord in Syria, and therefore he plays for time, as usual.
I think it's a shame. Use the fact that they are removing chemical weapons as a reason not to try to help the people who are fighting and dying as we speak.
A new front has now opened in Syria. Rebels are still fighting governmental forces, but they are now also fighting jihadist groups that are gaining ground. The opposition says Bashar al-Assad is playing the Islamist card, strengthening these jihadist groups to divert Western attention and remain in power.
The Assad regime, going back to the Hama massacre of 1982, had always tried to paint all opposition to the regime as a foreign-inspired jihadist uprising against the state, and it made it illegitimate. And to help fulfill this prophecy, he released a number of Salafist and jihadist figures who were in prison.
We did not release jihadists from Syrian prisons. That's just wrong. It's not credible information. Of course, Syrian authorities have released Syrian citizens. Maybe there were a few jihadists among them, but that does not mean Syrian authorities released them on purpose.
No, that's not true. Bashar Jafari is a liar. They released Sheikh Saran Aloush, the leader of the Islamist Front, for example. He was in prison and was free. Bashar al-Assad talked about Islamist groups from the very beginning. And since there were none, he tried to create them.
There are now 26,000 Islamist radicals there. There are 7,000 foreign fighters, some of them from France. And these people are the most extreme. And it's interesting that in the areas they control, Bashar al-Assad doesn't attack.
We are seeing a sort of laissez-faire regarding terrorists on our borders. I'm talking about the presence of 80,000 foreign terrorists from 83 countries. They're sponsored by the Saudis, trained by the Americans and the French, given logistical help by the Turkish authorities, etc.
By agreeing to get rid of its chemical weapons, the Syrian regime wanted to show its good faith. Then, it agreed to enter into political negotiations. In January, at the Geneva II conference, Syrian officials sat down for the very first time at the same table as representatives of the opposition, representatives that had so far been called terrorists by the Syrian government.
Fighting terrorism is one thing. Agreeing with the political opposition is another. These are two parallel lines that do not cross paths.
If one side cannot defeat the other militarily, there would have to be some sort of negotiated solution. But the problem is the Assad regime sees a transitional governing body in Syria based on the re-election of President Assad to a third term as president.
Either you hold elections, you're a Democrat, and everyone respects you despite the circumstances. Or you don't hold elections, and everyone will be on your case, criticizing you for not holding elections. It's either one or the other.
What presidential elections? This is crazy. There are 4 million Syrians abroad and 5 or 6 million in the country who no longer have a home. Another 4 million have fled to other regions. How will he organize free elections?
There is no good option now in Syria. The worst option is doing nothing. That's the worst option. You won't change the situation on the battlefield with half measures. You've got to shoot down those helicopters that are dropping the barrel bombs. You've got to have anti-armor weapons that will stop their tanks and artillery. Otherwise, you'll just see a continued stalemate and slaughter.
I'm not just frustrated. I am completely desperate when I look at the international community and its supposed justice.
Chemical weapons are awful. They wreak tremendous havoc and suffering on the people it affects. But more people have been killed by conventional weapons, many more than by the chemical weapons, and we really must not forget that.
Back in 2011, when the world was still talking about a Syrian revolution and not a war, Western leaders believed Bashar al-Assad would be toppled in a matter of months or even weeks. 3 years later, the Syrian president is still in power and looks stronger than ever, faced with a divided opposition and an international community incapable of finding a way out of the crisis. For the Syrian government, the threat of a red line seems like a distant memory.